What's going on, Summoners? Welcome back to another Wild Rift video. My name is Kangas, and today we'll be going over the 6 champions that you should absolutely avoid if you want to win more games. These champions are just not suited to the current Wild Rift meta and have been underperforming compared to their League of Legends counterparts. So let's get straight into it. First up, VAYNE is everybody's favorite slippery, silverbolt slinging carry with boundless outplay potential and montages filled with clips of her pentakills. Even when her win rate is low, her play rate stays relatively high because she's just extremely fun and can create some incredibly high moments. However, she's really not the greatest pick on the Wild Rift. When playing VAYNE, it's crucial to be very precise with your movement and tumbles. The touchscreen controls for Wild Rift are relatively good, but you just can't reach the same level of precision that you can with a mouse and keyboard. Because of this mechanical limitation, her outplay potential is diminished on the Wild Rift. VAYNE's lane phase is also extremely weak when compared to the meta marksman. Champions like Jhin and Miss Fortune have an incredibly easy time accruing substantial advantages throughout the lane phase, and this lack of pressure will result in you losing tower plates and dragons. On the Wild Rift, when you get ahead, it's pretty easy to stay ahead. VAYNE's outplay potential doesn't come online until at least level 6, and even then her trading is still extremely weak. If she wants to trade, she has to force an all-in, which more often than not is impossible after her weak early levels. She just doesn't do enough damage to compete in the early game and will be constantly zoned from the creep wave. Meta supports like Seraphine and Soraka can also poke her out extremely easily, making her laning phase even harder to navigate. VAYNE heavily relies on levels in her silver bolts and her item power spikes to become a relevant champion in the game. Wild Rift games tend to contain a large amount of early fights and skirmishes, which VAYNE really doesn't contribute much to. She needs a long and slow game, which doesn't happen often. Her team is likely to be losing in the early game, which makes it even harder for her to reach her spikes and be able to carry. It's simply too hard to consistently get the mileage you want to out of this champ, and while that occasional pop buff game may feel great, they don't happen often enough to warrant maining this champ. So make sure to avoid VAYNE if you're looking to climb. FIZZ is one of the most hated champions specifically because of his E, Playful Trickster, making him untargetable and incredibly mobile. He's known for one-shotting carries and escaping on a sliver of health, but on the Wild Rift, let's say he's just far less consistent. FIZZ sports long cooldowns on most of his abilities. He also has to commit all of his abilities to have any hope of taking out a carry, leaving him with nothing left to avoid damage or escape death. He has plenty of damage to take out carries if he lands his ultimate, however it's extremely easy to block as well, and because the Wild Rift is small and teamfights are common, finding angles to actually land the fish on a crucial carry is particularly difficult. Even if you do land the fish and secure the kill, your death is all but certain since all of your escape options are on cooldown and the enemy team will easily finish you off. Stasis Enchant is a crucial tool for FIZZ, but it's also 1,000 gold investment for no additional damage stats, which can really put you behind. Teamfights and multi-man skirmishes are super important on the Wild Rift, and FIZZ thrives when he can find isolated sidelines and duels against squishy members. When he's faced with teams filled with CC though, he finds it very hard to operate successfully. He doesn't have the tools to consistently find assassinations and dodge CC, so the later the game goes, the worse he becomes. You have to be a very talented, creative, and precise player to make FIZZ work. However, there's just better champs to utilize these skills on, and yes, I'm talking about Zed. Before we move on, our question of the day is, which champion do you absolutely hate seeing on your team? As a support player, I just hate laning with VAYNE. She's so trash, but make sure to let us know your answers in the comments down below. Okay, let's be honest, AURELION has one of the coolest aesthetics out there, and his abilities look extremely powerful. But in game, they don't really follow through with the image that they represent, and AURELION ends up being one of the weakest champions on the Wild Rift. ASOL is good at pushing in the early game and has tools to roam around and assist his sidelines. These are generally valuable assets for a champion, and they are indeed still valuable on the Wild Rift. The problem with ASOL is that everything after the first 3 minutes is a huge problem. The first problem he faces is that his damage is just pretty poor, and he doesn't get any better throughout the game. In the early game, he can pump out some DPS with the stars, but after that, his item build gets extremely awkward, and actually finding a point where you deal a lot of damage is just borderline impossible. His ratios aren't great, and his kit is really undertuned to compensate for his roaming capabilities. Actually dealing damage without dying is also very hard, which brings us to his second major problem. AURELION is typically outranged and outspaced by champions like Jinx or Seraphine, making it really hard for him to get into range to actually deal damage, and even if he does, they can just crowd control him and quickly move out of his range again. These meta champions make it really hard for him to perform in teamfights. The other group of champions that ruin Aurelion Sol's day are champions that can dodge his damage by gap closing onto him. Almost every strong meta champion, looking at Camille, Amumu, or Zed, can easily dash past his stars and kill him extremely quickly. Aurelion Sol thrives when he can keep you at medium range, but most things can either get onto his head too easily or just stay far enough away. Almost every meta jungler can either gap close or avoid your CC, so you'll even be struggling to fight in those early skirmishes. You think Aurelion Sol is an early game powerhouse, but once everybody starts to group up and fight, unless he's already broken open the game, it's going to be really hard to win. For now, I'd recommend keeping away from him in ranked games entirely. Yasuo is one of the most popular champions in the game, with a huge community of mains and casual players just always picking him whether he's good or not. He's absurdly fun to dash through creeps with and one of the smoothest champions in the game to play. He's also one of the most frustrating to play against, with his projectile deleting wind wall being one of the most hated abilities in the entire game. With infinite room for outplays and loads of resentment sent his way, it's easy to assume that he is a strong champion. However, he doesn't really possess enough survivability. His damage is hard to get off, and it's difficult to get the most out of his kit with mobile controls. Similar to Aurelion Sol, Yasuo really struggles against common meta champions like Amumu, Camille, and Fiora. Yasuo lacks mobility without a minion wave, and these champions will put him in the dirt if he's caught without one. And even with one, it's still pretty tough to outplay them. He requires an extremely high level of execution to reach a point of viability, and the amount of effort you have to put into becoming an insane Yasuo player would be far more wisely spent on pretty much any other champion in the game, that aren't on this list of course. The rewards you get for mastering Yasuo simply isn't very high, other than the coolness, while other champions will perform well with only a few games worth of time. Yasuo shines against enemy compositions filled with ranged champions to dash between that have their crowd control blocked by his wind wall. You can absolutely have some pop-off teamfights when played perfectly, but a huge limiting factor is that he often has to wait for someone else on his team, like an Alistar or Malphite, to set him up with that huge knockup. Or he just has to wait out the enemy team CC abilities before he can engage. An overzealous Yasuo getting headbutt pulverized the moment he dashes forwards will often just be game losing, and it takes extreme patience and understanding to find the moments that you can engage. To sum it up, Yasuo just isn't worth the time and dedication, and you'll find yourself with a much higher rank playing a better champion. Ziggs is a bomb-tossing artillery mage, known for breaking down towers and finishing off low-health enemies with Mega Inferno Bomb. He's a powerhouse laner and good at pushing towers, but honestly, he just doesn't have many other strengths. Artillery mages are particularly weak on the Wild Rift because they don't have the space necessary to keep their distance and keep tossing out their skills, and they're typically very item and gold reliant, which they can't get much of before the skirmishes start in this game. Ziggs has skill shots on all 4 of his abilities, making him relatively hard to play. It's very hard to accurately land your low cooldown bombs while keeping the enemy at arm's length. This is exacerbated by the meta, which tends to include champions that are very good at gap closing. The damage potential for Ziggs is somewhat high, but it's all hard to hit consistently, and finding opportunities to actually deal damage will be difficult. Overall, his payoff just isn't high enough for how inconsistent he is, and his strengths don't align with how the typical Wild Rift game plays out. He is pretty fun, so you can give him a go in a normal game, but don't expect to be stomping your first few games. If you want someone like Ziggs who's just better suited for the Wild Rift, just do yourself a favor and try out Lux. VAYNE might have big fists for punching, but she does not have big tools for winning. Her early game brawling isn't awful, but it's about all that she's good at. Her single target lockdown from her ultimate, Assault and Battery, is good for locking down champions like FIZZ and Yasuo, but they're not really particularly good inside of the current Wild Rift meta anyway, so that's not even that useful. To be frank, VAYNE just doesn't have any fantastic selling points. Most champions that are highly rated have some excellent attributes and are generally good at most things. VAYNE, on the other hand, is decent at locking down a single target for a moment, but apart from that, she just falters. Her clear speed is okay, her ganks are pretty underwhelming, and her base damage is fine, but doesn't really scale that well. See, she just doesn't have much going for her. VAYNE can find some use in a dive-heavy composition featuring champions like Malphite and Zed, helping her lock down and secure kills on primary targets. However, her job is just simply done better by other champions, primarily Lee Sin. With proper use of his kick, he can achieve pretty much the same, if not better results as VAYNE. Everything that VAYNE does, Lee Sin does better. So unless this champ absolutely calls out to you, just pick up Lee Sin instead. And that wraps up our 6 champions to avoid if you want to win games on the Wild Rift. We want to clarify these champions aren't completely completely worthless and can definitely be played, but they're just not that great and it's overly difficult to make them work. Your time would be better spent elsewhere learning champions that are more powerful and more suited to this game. If you really enjoyed one of these champions, don't be afraid to play them, just be mindful that you might have to outperform the other players in your games to secure the win. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure to like the video if you enjoyed the content, sub to the channel so that we can continue to grow and provide you more guides and trick videos. Good luck on the Wild Rift, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.